That might go ahead. Okay, I will go ahead. So this is one of a pair of roundtable discussions that we'll have at this year's ACJS that aim to bring scholars of Canadian Jewish life into dialogue with scholars of Australian Jewish studies. So first of all, a special welcome to our Australianists. Thank you guys so much for coming. It's early where you are or late where you are in Jerusalem. It's really nice to be able to welcome you to a conference that's normally just Canadianists. So the second panel is tomorrow around this time, and it will be devoted exclusively to history. Today we have a mixed discipline panel. So for those of you from the ACJS who came last year, we did something similar with Canadianists and scholars of Latin American Jewish studies. And I, for one anyway, found it to be a very engaging pair of conversations. And I'm pleased to announce that more scholarship will arise out of those conversations. There's been some kind of little things, and at minimum, a book that will be devoted to writing that compares Canadian Jewish life with Argentinian Jewish life that will be published by Brill Press, hopefully by the end of fall 2023. So what I'd like to happen here is basically just to generate some productive dialogue about the two fields' respective orthodoxies, about their preoccupations, about what's missing in their fields of scholarship, to consider maybe where the fields overlap or could overlap, and to brainstorm ideas for some future research or some prospective insight that might grow out of considering how these two fields speak to one another, maybe in a comparative way or a translational way, or maybe some collaborative manners that we or other people that are interested in this conversation might explore. So once our panelists, I have some questions for everybody, and we're just going to sort of jump in. I can try to guide speakers, but feel free to just jump in, keep yourselves unmuted, panelists. Once our panelists do begin to share their thoughts, I'll just cut and paste their bios into the chat so that all of you can know who's who without taking the time up of having to read these aloud together. So to kick us off, I wanted to ask about the extent to which the scholarly discussion of Canadian Jewish studies and Australian Jewish studies, to what extent they clash with or derive from or complement the kinds of preoccupations that the community as a whole, communal preoccupations of contemporary Canadian Jewries or contemporary Australian Jewries. So are the communities themselves and the issues that communities are grappling with and the study of Canadian Jewish life or Australian Jewish life, are they similar? Are they different? David, maybe you'll start us off for the Australianists.
Good morning, good evening. I can talk about the Jewish community's preoccupations, given my role at JCA, which is a communal hub representing 25 of the organizations in Sydney. So that position allows me to understand exactly where the community is standing. So the preoccupations or the ongoing themes of fundraising, we'll put it that way, there are several. Education is one. So in Australia, Jewish schooling is common. Over 50% of the kids are in Jewish schools, but the Jewish schools are all private. And affordability is a big issue for the schools, and ensuring that children that want to be in those schools can that can be funded when they don't have the means to do that. So affordability, economics in the community. So in both Melbourne and Sydney, which is where 90% of Jews live in Australia, Jews live in the most salubrious, most expensive parts of the city. So in addition to the expensive school fees, there's the expensive housing costs and the expensive cost of living. So the general economic sustainability of the community is a big preoccupation. It's a wealthy community, but obviously not everybody is fortunate enough to be wealthy. I would say two other themes immigration is an ongoing concern in Australia. So Australia's done extremely well from a migrant point of view. It's grown and grown and grown for several decades off the back of other diaspora countries losing Jewish population, particularly South Africa. But even pre-COVID, it was quite clear that net migration into Australia was already tapering off. So the big question that looms is, how will the community sustain itself going forward? It's 115, 120,000 Jews here. So it's not tiny, but its long-term demographic situation is not quite as comfortable as it would have been, say, 10 years ago. And it's not at all obvious where the next immigration trend is going to come from. Anti-Semitism is an issue. I think others will be able to talk more clearly on that, but that's a perennial issue here. I don't think anti-Semitism is a particularly enormous problem in Australia, but it is a background theme for all the communities here. And continuity. I wouldn't say intermarriage is top of the list, but it's always there, and it's a sub-theme for the topics of education, of course, and schooling. Perhaps there's not a fear here, but there is a sort of a background concern. Oh, well, how are we going to ensure that our children are educated and remain within the Jewish fold? Those are the preoccupations. To what extent they align with the Jewish studies field here, I would put a big question mark on. I'm not convinced that there's much overlap at all. In fact, I think the community does its thing and academia does its thing almost as an independent bubble. There is the occasional overlap. There was a survey called Gen 17 that was jointly funded between the community in Melbourne and Sydney. It was a national study and a national Jewish identity survey through Monash. So, but that was a rare thing. Once every 10 years, those sort of surveys happen. So that, I think, presents the groundwork. Perhaps there are others here that can talk further about the...
I'd like Mort to respond to the Canadian side, but David, do you have a sense of, or could you say briefly what the preoccupations then of the scholarly community who's considering Australian Jewish life are preoccupied with, if not this communal concerns?
Yeah, I can talk to it in as much as I am vaguely familiar with the literature. I'm not associations with University of Sydney, but I'm not based in the department, but I know the scholars. The key themes in the departments in University of Sydney and Monash, and Adina can probably talk more thoroughly about Melbourne, but for example, so in Sydney University, it's called the Department of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies. Okay, and the key study offerings are biblical studies and classical Hebrew, modern Hebrew, Jewish civilization, thought and culture, all worthy themes. But given what I've just described about the preoccupations of the community, there's minimal overlap there. We have a Jewish museum, a Holocaust museum here that Breann can talk about more articulately than I will be able to, but that's primarily there as an educational tool for the general public. So although there's plenty of Holocaust study going on, it's again, from the community's point of view, from its own preoccupations, there's a dissonance in Melbourne. There's a department that's interested in Yiddish and Yiddish speaking. Again, there is a very, very tiny Yiddish speaking community in Melbourne, but I don't suspect that the certainly not relevant in Sydney. So the themes that the departments are interested in do not in any sense dovetail, in my experience, with the concerns of the community itself.
I might just quickly jump in there, which is in terms of the Holocaust and the way it dovetails with the preoccupations of the community, is in the Gen 17 survey, 95% of Jewish people said their identity was fundamentally defined by remembering the Holocaust. And I think that is a preoccupation, particularly of the Sydney community. And we've seen, for example, an enormous uptake amongst my own generation in the 20s and 30s, particularly there's an organization called Youth Here, Holocaust Education and Remembrance, and they do remarkable things. And so there is quite a preoccupation in terms of that side of Jewish history and culture, shall we say. And in terms of Holocaust education as well, I know the Melbourne people will be able to talk about the recent Gandel survey as well, about the preoccupation with the Holocaust and Holocaust education as well.
Dara, do you want to jump in before we go back wide again with Mort's comments?
Sure. Similar data here in Toronto, especially among young people, really identifying very closely with the Holocaust remembrance as a key component of their Jewish identity, and I would say there is a preoccupation in this community as well with Holocaust education and remembrance. That sounds very similar to Australia,
and a good deal of scholarship that's focused on it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a dovetail for Canada.
Yeah.
Mort?
Okay, well, hi everyone. It's nice to see everyone. So I just made a few notes, which I'll try to make cohere in some way or another. So the first thing is, the Canadian Jewish community and the Australian Jewish community are very, very similar, except in the ways that they are very different. That's a little bit of humor to begin, but that's true. So I'm going to go through some of the ways I see similarities and some of the ways I see some differences, and then maybe that can help and some of these have already been touched on. So I think that both communities, and I think the scholars that use a very wide lens, are interested in two things. One is sort of anti-Semitism, or the position of Jews in that society as historic other, and now maybe not so much other or different other, and what that means. And we can unpack that later, okay? And the other is, of course, survival. The whole cultural package. And that includes education, but it also includes things like identity, can include things like Holocaust, where that fits in, and intermarriage, all of that package. That's sort of more of the internal struggles within the community as opposed to some of the more external ones. So both countries are countries in the New World as opposed to those in the Old World, i.e. Europe, and if you will, North Africa, the Middle East, etc. I won't go into all of that, but I think these are all sort of possibly important. Immigration, therefore, has played a tremendous role and continues to play an important role in Canada and Australia in terms of sources of growth. Both of these countries espouse something called multiculturalism, or have espoused that in the past. Maybe there's differences now, but that has certainly been something central. Both of these are liberal democratic countries, which are both, sort of Anglophilic countries in a certain way in terms of language and culture, etc. Both of them have been shaped by the dynamics between two key cities in Canada, Montreal and Toronto, and in Australia, Sydney and Melbourne, wonderful communities in both. Both of these broad societies are wrestling at present with the Indigenous question, if I can phrase it that way, in both societies. And David can speak to this, of course, but this also is shaping one of the challenges facing the Jews in Canada and the Jews in Australia and the Jews in the United States. Where do we fit in to this new ethnic racial mix or dynamic or paradigm? Are we allies? With whom are we allies? Are we victims again of another sort? Where do we fit into that space? And it's not just it's also a racialized space. It's not just Indigenous, but it's a racialized space. Have the Jews become white? Is the way in which some sociologists phrase that. I'm going to go quickly here. Israel is an interesting fact now that I think colors our discussions of what we used to call anti-Semitism. But now it's much broader, and it requires a lot of soul searching, both within the community and also, in terms of us in relation to the broader society in which we find ourselves. Maybe that'll come up later. All right, I'm just going to go very quickly through some differences or similarities. One thing that intrigues me is the relationship to the Pacific, the Atlantic versus the Pacific. Now, at first, I don't have to tell the Australians here that, Australia's self-definition is sometimes complex in terms of whether it's a European or Western country, is a Pacific country. I leave that to the Australians to resolve. But, what's interesting in Canada is that whereas immigration used to be historically European, right, and shaped us, for the past 30 or 40 years, it's been largely Asian. North African, Middle Eastern, and also generally Asian, including South Asia and East Asia, which is similar to Australia. Canada has the issue of Quebec. Maybe Yolande will want to comment. And Quebec has been a fundamental element of Canadian history, and the Jewish community in Montreal has been so important. And so what you have in Quebec are a series of new challenges which are specific to that province. Some of you may know of these things. One of them is called Bill 21, one of them is called Bill 96. And so once again, the Jewish community in Quebec is, I think, about to rethink its position or be challenged in its position in Quebec as it has been in the past. Finally, there's the degree of external influence. This is my last point. Canada is right next to the United States. So we're like a mouse sleeping next to an elephant. The elephant rolls over, we get squashed. But this is both a challenge but an advantage, which we can discuss later. Whereas, and the American influence on the Jewish community here is, I think, quite pronounced. Many people, I can't speak for the people here, but I know I have 3 kids, one is living in the United States. I'm not alone. There's just a lot of that movement. Whereas I think in Australia, the dominant hegemon is Great Britain, is England. Maybe there isn't one, and the distance is very great. But if I look at the history of Australia and some of the cultural influences, it's not quite the same. And I don't know if England is seen as a model, as a threat, or as an asset. I don't know how that plays out in terms of the Jewish community in Australia. So I think those are some similarities, but also some interesting differences that we may want to unpack as our conversation continues. I'm sorry I went on too long.
No, not at all. You put a lot of cards on the table, and these things will come up. Some of them maybe more than others. So thank you, Mort. That was very thorough. I'm just going to pull us back to the original question, though, and give Adina a chance to respond, which was about the communal preoccupations and the world of scholarships preoccupations. Adina's actually published. I think you're the only one on this panel who's published specifically on, or will have published soon when this book comes out on Australia and Canada. So Adina, and then Yolande, you're going to start. You're going to have our lead off for the next question.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. As it's interesting because I guess the story of Australian Jewry is really a tale of 2 cities. Just like it would be crazy to talk about Canada and refer only to Toronto, because there are other groups. In your case, I mean, Australians are pretty much monolingual unless they accidentally learned something overseas, and Canada's far more multilingual, if not bilingual. So there are differences actually, Mort, that you've raised that I'd like to respond to. But in looking at perhaps Melbourne versus Sydney, there are some differences. There are some substantial differences that make the communal preoccupations perhaps somewhat different. I think that David touched on the idea that he works for the JCA. Thank God for the JCA, because if not for that, we actually wouldn't have a social scientist in Australia. So he's the last man standing when it comes to social science and demography and population studies that we actually have on the island. Everyone else is overseas. And one thing that's quite challenging when it comes to Melbourne is it's very decentralized, it's very concentrated geographically. 51% of Victorian Jewry live in one local government area. My kids found it incomprehensible that people actually had to walk more than a half an hour, 45 minutes to actually see someone else that they knew. That's the way that they grew up before we moved to Israel. And yet it's a divided community in terms of leadership. So in looking at the question of, what is it that leaders, philanthropists, communal sort of heads, and what's their relationship to academics? I mean, who do you speak to? In Sydney, there's one address. In Melbourne, I could probably talk to 24 people and each of them would disagree about who else was the leader, although that probably sounds very Jewish. So what I actually did in preparation for this presentation was I actually interviewed a couple of dozen people across the philanthropic, communal leadership and academic space to try and tease out their ideas. And I'm going to touch on the themes that David hasn't had a look at, although some of them did come up quite often in what I was in what I discussed with them. And one of them was the paucity of well-trained Jewish studies teachers. Before I got my PhD in social science and moved into academic research, I was a Jewish studies and English teacher at the largest Jewish day school in Melbourne. And you were expected to come qualified. There are no training courses anywhere in Australia, not for Jewish studies learning, not for pedagogy, not for curriculum development, not for principal or any kind of educational leadership training whatsoever. Hence the tendency often to grab at an import from overseas and exploit talent that comes from overseas. But if we talk about the disconnect and what David was touching on in terms of the disconnect between communal concerns and academic aspirations and preoccupations, there's no one actually teaching the teachers, despite the fact that in Melbourne we have 10 Jewish day schools and in Sydney there's about 4 or 5. That's a lot of teachers. A lot of teachers and a lot of teachers who aren't actually getting any ongoing professional development at all on site, unless it's within their own schools that are purchasing curriculum overseas. Canadians are in the Northern Hemisphere, so for you, the idea of a wintertime Shavuot and a summertime Hanukkah probably sounds quite foreign. That's quite normal for us. And hence, when you get curriculum from a Northern Hemisphere country, because you can't create your own, you present yourself with all sorts of funny, quirky things that happen in anytime you buy something that's an import. Another thing I'd like to touch on is Israel. Mort, you did touch on it slightly. Australians, when I did my comparative chapter, they do visit Israel frequently, as do Canadians. But what I found fascinating in looking at the two studies was the questions that Canadians didn't ask. And when I spoke to one of the people who was the lead researcher, I guess David's Melbourne counterpart to the Gen 17 study. And I said, why is it that Canadians didn't ask if people were Zionists? Why didn't the Canadians ask whether people would make Aliyah at some time in the future? Why didn't they ask them if international events put Israel in danger, what would best describe their emotional response? And the response that I got to that was, you can't ask those sorts of questions anywhere outside of Australia. There is an emotional connection to Australia has to Israel, which I would, and I think we'd need to look at this probably on a much more qualitative level to really understand that emotional relationship. Perhaps it derives from our very high Holocaust survivor population and their children. We have an academic at Monash who identifies as a third-generation Holocaust survivor. He doesn't say his grandfather's a survivor. He's taken on that identity fully. And as Breann was saying, that's not uncommon. There are people from all over Australia who are distant from the Holocaust by several generations and have taken on that identity fully and see a tremendous amount of value in pursuing that academically. And of the 6 tenured positions at Monash, 4 of them are devoted to Holocaust and genocide studies, which really shows the obsession and the focus on survival. So that's one thing that's also really interesting. So yes, it is a communal concern, but a communal concern, one of several communal concerns. And another thing that I just want to touch on, then I'll hold off from there. When I spoke to some of the newly minted academics working at Monash, they said that they were very excited to shift from, they're still doing Holocaust, but to start looking at something that they saw as an extremely important communal concern, and that was a study of culture in Melbourne. Jewish culture, where Jewish culture comes from. There was a mention before of the fact that Yiddish is spoken by a small minority in Melbourne. Within the same city block, there are two groups of people speaking Yiddish: the Satmar community, which is growing, and the descendants of the Bundist community. I actually grew up thinking that my father wasn't Jewish because he told me he was Bundist. And when I was 7, I thought Bundist was Buddhist, and I wasn't really sure what that meant. But there's a small, thriving academic community of descendants of Bundists who are Yiddish speaking, who are reading in Yiddish. And not that the Satmar and the secular Yiddishists talk to each other at all, but there is a tremendous interest amongst several key funders in exploiting that. So when we speak about communal concerns and academic aspirations and focuses, I think some of the communal concerns are being tapped in on because those funders are making those things happen when it comes to perhaps more social science endeavours. That's yet to happen.
Fantastic. My next question is about the extent to which these respective fields are integrated or in dialogue with the non-Canadian or non-Australian scholarship. So I'm thinking about, both the Jewish studies, in discussion with Canadian studies, with Australian studies, but also in terms of sort of empire research. In Canada, we've got British Empire, we both have sort of British Empire and Commonwealth research, but we also have the French Empire and the French kind of global orbit into which some parts of the Canadian Jewish studies may fit. And I'm wondering if we see good integration, or the Jewish studies preoccupations are totally different from what you see as these other sorts of parallel contexts or scholarly questions that are out there. Yolande, would you try this one first?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I got lots of thinking coming in. I'm just back from a heritage trip in Morocco. And in the plane going to Morocco, there was this very loud group of people from Toronto, 85 Jews from Toronto, going back to Morocco to do this heritage trip and going back to their roots. Obviously, they were from the Spanish part of Morocco, and they were going back to there. So it was really like going back somehow, I don't know, back in time. It was really a very strange situation. And all of a sudden, I thought, listening to you, that in a way, the empire that we are related to here as Moroccan Jews in Montreal or in Toronto was in a way very linked to their identity search. So this identity search was really linked to somehow trying to find out where they were fitting in Toronto or in Montreal, because this kind of, when we were there were all those groups from Israel. 80,000 Israeli Jews had been going back to Morocco within the accord of the Abraham Accord, and it's really working. They're going back and they're searching for their roots, and they're looking for their houses, and they're going to the cemeteries. And so I can't help myself thinking about it, because I'm just back from this incredible trip, but also to say that for education purposes, actually those people are really looking forward in tapping the Sephardi type of diaspora. And they're not looking in Montreal into trying to get their education, but into the Alliance. And the old Alliance Israélite Universelle organization, which is really very large and international, is still the place where they're doing their education and doing their formation. So the École Maïmonide, for instance, in Montreal, is still having their teachers educated within the Alliance network. So they not really in Montreal. They are in Montreal, but they are really linked to this very incredible network of people where they are doing their formation, their education. And that's the thing that I was thinking of when you were talking about the need for education. So I agree again with you when you say that there is a distortion or a big divide between whatever we do as academics and what the community, the Sephardic community, I'm talking about the Sephardic community because that's the one I know most in Montreal, but more generally, as Mort had been also saying, the Jewish community in Montreal is very, very separated from the academic milieu, at least from what I understand of what they're expecting. Sometimes you have some philanthropists at the Sephardi Federation. The Canadian Sephardi Federation is now headed by a philanthropist from Toronto and in Montreal too, who wants to do conferences, organization. Like last year, he did the Holocaust in North Africa, Holocaust and North Africa, and he invited people from Morocco and Tunisia, academics, Muslim academics that are working in trying to get Holocaust studies into the curriculum in the Moroccan schools and Tunisian schools. And he invited us, he invited me to talk about my own views about it. And he wants to do another conference. So it's really very strange the way they're tapping into academics. They just, when they feel the need of having us, they invite us, but there is no exchange. We have no, we haven't succeeded in getting Jewish studies in French at the University of Montreal or University of UQAM. We don't have any type of Jewish study department. The Jewish studies are included within the theology department or in the religious studies at UQAM, University of Quebec in Montreal. So there were talks about having a chair in Jewish studies in French. It never materialized, really. So in a way, there is a very big divide between the two, even though the Sephardic community had been trying very much to be involved into the discussion of the Francophone Quebec nationalist question without really succeeding into establishing some kind of stronghold within the Quebec society. So it's, for the time being, it's more like a folklore. Like they invite some Quebec politician to the Mimouna, to the activity of the Mimouna, but there's no big not that I see any kind of strong affiliation between the two. So it seems to me that even though the Sephardic community had been trying to establish its own identity in French, separating itself from the Anglophone community of Montreal, the Jewish community, it's still within, it still is like a small brother of the big Jewish community, which is Anglophone, and following into the path of the Anglophone community. So the Holocaust Museum, for instance, is directed by a Sephardic Jew who is really trying his best to associate himself to include some of the Holocaust studies that are now developing within North Africa, and trying to include the Vichy story of the Jews into the curriculum within the Holocaust Museum, which is going to move now to on the Saint Laurent street. So sorry for getting all these just glimpses, because for me, it's really still is the Sephardi community within Quebec is still trying to find its place, and Israel, as you mentioned, is very much an attraction, and at the same time an attraction within this divided identity between Morocco, Israel, and Canada. And it seems to me that 60 years after their arrival in Canada, the Sephardic community is still really very much looking for its identity. So that's the thing that I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a natural that we'll put lots of pieces out on, put things out, and that, there's a lot to cover. So it's fine that we just kind of get it all. I wanted to know if anyone else wanted to respond to the sort of prompt about Jews and others in Australia or in Canada, or about Jewish studies, the extent to which Jewish studies in either place is sort of in productive dialogue with empire studies, with British Empire, Commonwealth, or the French Empire. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Maybe for the Australians.
Sure.
Yeah, we've got the Queen on the back of our coins and got the Union Jack in the top left corner of our flag, but we're not really that British influenced. I don't feel it as an Australian. Queen's very nice. We like her grandchildren, but I don't really think, well, actually some of her grandchildren, but I don't really think that there's a sense of British influence as there may have been when my parents were growing up and they used to sing God Save the Queen before they watched a movie, and before, when the British currency was Australian currency.
I'm thinking my question might actually be much more of a historical one. So maybe it's something that I could say for the historians panel, unless someone has really burning need to answer this particular one. All right, let me pivot. Actually, maybe Breann or Dara, is there something that's come up that I'm just cognizant that you've had less of the floor. Are there things that have come up anywhere so far that you'd really like to respond to?
I'm curious to discuss the Indigenous issues and the sort of shared initiatives that the Australian, Canadian, Jewish studies and museums are, how they're dealing with these histories. And I think David and Professor Weinfeld know that we're building a Holocaust museum here in Toronto, and we had a very fruitful conversation with the Canadian Jewish Studies scholars around the issue of Indigenous and how do you recognize what happened here while talking about the settlement of Holocaust survivors in Canada in the 50s and 60s, and so I think we've actually come up with some really nice solutions in the museum. And I'm sort of curious how it's going to be received by the Jewish public.
The panel before this one had a paper that was specifically devoted to this question. So we had some discussion. Maybe you'll be able to follow up with the video afterwards.
Great. Breann, I'm curious how and if you've dealt with this in the Holocaust Museum context.
Yes, so it's a really important point, and I should preface what I'm about to say by saying that we're in the process at present of developing a reconciliation action plan with Reconciliation Australia as a museum, which is something that's recommended for institutions to create in order to have an actual structure to move forward with reconciliation. As a museum, we do address it in a number of different ways. Every formal program, whether that's a school program or a public program, does have an acknowledgement of country to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Also in 2017, I believe we opened our Human Rights Centre, which is a permanent human rights centre, which looks at 4 Australian human rights issues, one of which is the rights of Indigenous Australians. So it's actually part of our permanent exhibition. It's also part of our Holocaust exhibition, where we discuss William Cooper, who was an Indigenous elder who created a petition to protest Kristallnacht here in Australia. So we do mention it. I think it will be important as part of the reconciliation action plan for it to be more a part of everything we do. We've also started, for example, trying to engage with Indigenous-led businesses. So when we had to all buy rat tests for COVID, we bought those from an Indigenous-led business, so that we're actually doing it as part of our supply chain. And I know that JCA, for example, had a wonderful event with Indigenous elders and Holocaust survivors speaking in dialogue. Maybe David might want to talk a little bit more about that. And we are working with Kinchilla Boys Home, which was a home for children that were stolen, and we're helping them in terms of actually recording their survivor testimony. So it's something that I think is quite integrated into what we do at the Sydney Jewish Museum.
Sounds great.
I'm certainly very interested in a sustained dialogue between Canadianists and Australians on this particular account, sociological, monumental, historical. What are the politics involved? What are the histories of Jewish Indigenous relations? So this is something that I think could be a really fascinating, co-authored paper or something like that. So if you Australianists know of people that are interested in this conversation, send them my way. I also wondered, maybe I'll just take a step back, because I think we're going to probably put a bunch of things on the table, and then more things will come. And then I'd like to be able to have some time for questions from the floor. So I know panelists, I sent you a whole bunch of questions. We might skip some of them. I'm going to go to the last one, which is about what you think might be gained from scholarly, deepening scholarly conversations between Canadianists and Australianists. Are there any specific themes or research projects that you think would actually be helpful to compare, not just interesting, but like really help your respective fields move forward? And that's because there are important parallels like the Indigenous one, or divergences that would, or comparable communities in some way. But maybe the differences will also be productive to examine, to develop a better sense of these two fields. Yeah, David.
I'll say a few words on that one. The benefits of comparing communities are not to be underestimated. You learn a hell of a lot about yourself when you juxtapose it with a different community. And one of the things I was really struck by looking through the Canadian Jewish identity report from 2-3 years ago was that the vast majority of that juxtaposition was Canada, US. And Canada looks really good when you compare it with the US, as may I say, well, most communities in the world, because the US is very much an exceptional case. And Mort sort of mentioned the elephant right at the beginning of this discussion. One of my advantages is that I hail from the UK, so a lot of the work I do juxtaposes Australia and the British Jewish community, and more recently the South African community, the Anglo world, and some work in in the UK that I've been involved with has been doing a lot of work in Europe as well. So with the European Union, we've done a lot of studies across Europe. From our point of view, the big missing link has been Canada all along. This link between the Anglo world and Canada has been a frustrating absence for the best part of 20 years that I've been involved in this kind of work. And when I pick up a report such as the one that we saw in Canada 3 years ago, and the juxtaposition is the United States, is increasingly frustrating. Come on, guys, America is very difficult to ignore. It's where everything's at. I know that, but you're one of us. So why are we separated like this? And I would add that, you know, we've got census data coming out in Australia. I believe the census data coming out in Canada very, very soon. The census data coming out in the UK. All these censuses ask a religion question, and Jewish is a category that gets ticked or mentioned. There's an absolute vast amount of data. I'm not sure I've seen since the early 90s any kind of paper that puts Australia and Canada next to each other, and you could put in Britain, you could probably put New Zealand in as well while we're talking about it. And it's just there sitting on a plate. It's not done. It wouldn't involve an enormous amount of expensive research to do that. Some work that Adina and I have done recently is comparing these survey data sets, and Adina mentioned some curious questions missing in the Canada work. And I would say that that's partly because Canada has been dominated so much by what's going on next door, to the expense of what everyone else is doing in the rest of the Anglo diaspora, for want of a better word. I think there are immensely interesting comparisons that can be done, and Mort beautifully summarized them at the beginning. Just in terms of geography, Canada and Australia are fascinatingly similar. So I look forward to being inundated after this with all sorts of offers of collaborative work going forward. But in all seriousness, there is enormous scope, and I'll pause there. But I hope that we can develop something off the back of these kinds of dialogues.
You know, David, mea maxima culpa. I plead guilty. So I've been teaching at McGill since 1977, a course on at first it was called the Sociology of Jews in North America, and now it's called Jews in North America. I've taught about 4,000 students over these years since 1977. And I am embarrassed to say that, well, you see it in the title, you know, Jews in North America. So the American-Canadian comparison, for better or for worse, David, is baked in. And I don't know to what extent we can break out of that. I will let you know that many decades ago, I think I wrote something either with Saul Cell, whose name you may know, or in a book he edited about Canadian Jewish life with some Australian commentary. Is he still alive, David, or has he passed on?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. But he was like the John Porter of Australia, a prominent sociologist. But you know, I just have not made any linkages in my work, and I think I can speak for most of the others that with Australia. Now, maybe this is a subject whose time has come, and that's very important. And as I said, there are interesting comparisons and differences that one can and should play with. But it's going to be hard to break out of that. I'm speaking frankly. And, you mentioned the study by Bob Brim, I think was the survey you're referring to. Look, the trouble that the Canadian Jewish community has is the trouble that Canada has had for 50, 60, 70 years in trying to carve out a meaningful Canadian identity out of the American shadow. Now, that was a very big controversial issue in the 60s and 70s, which I remember as a student. It was a big deal. Lately, it's been less of a deal. And, with some of the trends in the US, we're not looking that favorably on the American option right now. But now I will say that, as David recalls, he edited a book recently with, is Canada the best Jewish diaspora ever, to that extent? And as part of that project, David may recall, I looked at 4 countries: Canada, the United States, England, and France. And I looked at 2 kinds of measures of acceptance, participation, inclusion in the broader society, and also the strength of the Jewish community. And by and large, Canada did quite well in that comparison. So I don't know where this leaves the future, except one thing is clear, and I agree with David, this has been a neglected area. And I think there's something to be said for looking at these kind of middle range, mid-power. I once wrote an article with an Australian scholar, by the way, nothing to do with Jews, about geography and demography and Canada's empty spaces and Australia's empty spaces, and what that would mean, what that has meant and would mean for the future of those countries. These in the world. This has nothing to do with Jews. But, if you think about it, both of these countries are immigrant societies, New World societies. I think their populations have been well, Canada's been increasing. I think I don't know exactly what the recent breakdown is, David, in Australia, but so I'm saying that I can speak for some other social scientists that I know. There has not been this work done, and maybe it's time it should be done. And I think I'll stop there.
Breann and Dara, do you guys have any comments on this question about what fruitful collaboration might look like, what comparison specifically with respect to, I mean, both of our countries are populations with high Holocaust lots of Holocaust survivors and their descendants, and have taken sort of the work of commemoration, memorialization quite seriously, and these are your professional areas. Do you think this is a useful thing to do, or what might you look at?
I think there is this question that Mort had been raising. When did the Jewish communities became white? When did that happen? And is this only a turn of the social sciences into looking at the colonization and empire, etc.? But when did we become white? And in a way, this otherness that we were representing in both our countries became something else. And is this only linked to the Israeli question, or because as Israeli became citizens and oppressors, and how did we become all white and oppressors? And it has to do also with the reassessment of our relations with indigenous communities. And it's a very important one, even though we commemorate Holocaust studies and Holocaust history. How could we today become also, are we victims? Are we, these questions are really, really important, it seems to me, in assessing, and probably a comparative study might be very interesting to understand, to outline those questions.
Can I make a quick comment to what Yolande just said? This question of have the Jews become white does relate, as you say, to the Israel and the Middle East situation. The Jews are seen as European colonizers, as you know, in Israel, and the Jews, therefore, and there's been a history of this. The Jews once. Look, I'm not saying that the Jews are white, and certainly most Jews that I know do not think of themselves as white. Right. But that's not the issue. The issue is the external world. Think of the Jews now as white. They are no longer reliable allies in the struggle as they used to be. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that's the perception. So, and I'll end this by linking this to the Holocaust, which is a dominant force for identity, as we've said, in all these countries, dominant. What's interesting about the Holocaust and bringing the Holocaust to the fore is, on the one hand, it serves the need for some Jews, once again, to be victims. So it's a comfortable thing for many Jews in this very tense, Black like me environment to be seen as a victim. That's number one. Number two, though, is that the emphasis on the Holocaust, which I clearly support, I understand it, will not be able to solve the problem of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist feelings at all. On the contrary, I remember a speech given at McGill by a bunch of anti-Zionists, and Edward Said was the keynote speaker, and he was very clear. Edward Said was not a Holocaust denier. He thought the Holocaust was horrible. He knew all about the Holocaust, right? And then the next step was, it's too bad that the Jews made the Palestinians pay and suffer for the sins of the Europeans. So in other words, while we are perhaps wise strategically to emphasize the importance of the Holocaust, I don't think that'll solve the problems that we face on campus with BDS and Israel apartheid and all of this stuff that we see floating around. I think the two will persist. I don't know if any of this relates to Australia at all. I don't know about the campus environment on Australia, but I do know about it in Canada.
I can speak to the campus environment in terms of schools to some extent, and David and Adina might comment further, but we are seeing a concerning rise in anti-Semitism in school campuses, non-Jewish school campuses, I should say. The use of swastika as graffiti, Heil Hitler salutes, bullying of Jewish students. And I think, of course, some social media has something to answer for there. I think that there are two sort of areas of collaboration in that sense that I think would be very useful. Number one is anti-Semitism in schools. It would be really interesting to see a comparison between Australia and Canada. And the other thing I would really like to see, which we're trying to get an ARC grant for, but we've been unsuccessful in the first round, we're going back again, is a longitudinal study as to the impact of Holocaust education. You know, so many people come to us and they say, we came to your museum, it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. Yes, but how? Why? What do you remember? How has that influenced you as a human being? And is that a 6-month, a 10-year, a 20-year influence? Obviously, that's getting too large. But I think a longitudinal study between Holocaust education in Canada and Australia would provide us some really important insights in terms of, is there something that you're doing differently than what we're doing that has a better impact, or vice versa? And that's something I would really like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. We also talk about needing funding for longitudinal studies on the impact of Holocaust education, because we're seeing the exact same thing with a rise of anti-Semitism in schools. Different than I think what Mort is talking about, where with younger students, playground antics and that sort of thing. And in that case, I think there is a role for Holocaust education, because there's just a total lack of knowledge around what these Holocaust symbols mean, and where they come from, because they're just seeing them online, and they're seeing them in the news around the vaccination, but yes, I think what Mort's talking about on campus with the anti-Zionism, that whole Holocaust piece, I think doesn't necessarily have to play the same role as it does what we're seeing in the more elementary schools and middle school.
I want to give all the panelists a chance to collect some thoughts and think just broadly about things that you might have thought you might want to say before turning to questions from the floor. So, Australia and Canada, Jewish studies. Adina.
I don't think Australians, being geographically, and I think in terms of ideas, I think that the concept of race that has charged at least the discourse in the United States and perhaps also moved across to Canada as well. I don't think it's a preoccupation as much in Australia. I don't think it divides people as much. I do acknowledge, having been on campus as a student for far longer than most people, that there is conflict on campus, and race is an important question, and part of reconciliation with the Indigenous people is an important step in that sense. But race as a form of identity is not something that I hear. I mean, outside of academia, I really don't hear a lot of people talking about race. And I think looking at what concerns the two populations to sort of tease out differences might be interesting. The importance of second language, third language, I think in terms of as a value. The Canadians I know not only speak Hebrew better than Australians, but they also speak a lot of languages better. I'm interested in language acquisition. I'm interested in what happens in Canada that makes multilingualism possible, that does not, even after 15 years in Jewish day schools, our Jewish students aren't necessarily coming out particularly fluent in Hebrew, which some people care about, some people don't. So there's those areas. And I'm presenting at the World Jewish Congress in August, looking at the largest 5 English-speaking Jewish communities in the world, Canada being one of them, Australia being another. And one thing that strikes me is that unless you go down to a really statistical nitty-gritty level, on the surface, Canada, UK, South Africa, Australia, minor differences here and there, they're not so different. And although I think the USA is to be commended for the incredible investment in academia that has meant that they are the elephant in the room, because simply they're the ones that have done the bulk of the work. Going back to what Yolande said before, we have to make a better case for the importance of our field to persuade the funders to have those positions so that we can get that work happening. But I think in where we sit right now before that happens, the more collaborations we can do to demonstrate that we're not the exception to the rule, that the United States is the exception to the rule, and that we have a lot in common, and that I think there's a lot that we can learn from and with one another. I think that'd be a really good step forward.
I'm wondering if we are multilingual. I'm not sure we are very, I mean, some speak French, some others speak English, but I'm not sure it's a multilingual society, Canada. It wants to be, but it's a very important question. Yes, the language question, I agree with you, Adina, is a very important question.
I'm quite interested in this question about multiculturalism, both as federal policy and as a kind of fact on the ground, and how these two countries have changed over the past, 3 decades, say, and sort of the question about Jewish belonging, where it fits into a landscape of on the ground, de facto and de jure multiculturalism, and if there's something to learn about the sort of democratic experiments of post-national countries, because they seem like pretty good comparisons, good comparators, even better than the UK, or
My experience of Australia is it's the whitest place I've ever been in my life. And having grown up in multicultural London, it is always absolutely jarring to land at Heathrow and see the array of colours, and then come back to Sydney and see basically white. The only significant difference, and you're talking about the last 20, 30 years, and you've alluded to it already, is Asian migration. So particularly East Asian migration here. So there was a considerable movement from China and India. They were the big donor countries, if you like. And there are parts of Sydney that are and not just Chinatown, but there are parts of Sydney and suburbs that are clearly very ethnically diverse. But as a society, Australia is still whiter than white. And we just had a federal election here. I don't recall the issue of race appearing at any point. It's just not on the radar. And in comparison to what's been going on in the United States for the last 2-3 years, there is no comparison. Canada, I'm entirely ignorant about. So in that sense, it is not an issue, yet migration is, in the way that it is not relevant to the UK. So you're talking about the comparisons between Canada and Australia again. The importance of immigration, despite the racial whiteness here, migration is itself an issue, and there have been some pretty controversial migration decisions in Australia in the last decade or so that have even on the eve of the election, the Liberal Party tried to turn that into a scare tactic to save their dying chances, but which, if anything, backfired. Again, saying that I am ignorant of the immigration racial situation in Canada sort of underlies the fact that there is plenty of scope here to understand how these two societies have addressed migration and where Jews fit in. Jews are not seen as an immigrant group here. Holocaust survivors maybe, but I don't see, there isn't a case for that. But the questions that are of interest in Australia are your ancestry and not your color.
I think this is a really interesting discussion for us to be having, because at the Sydney Jewish Museum, we see about 30,000 kids a year, and migration studies in primary school, year 5 to 6, what be that, like 11 or 12, we can't keep up with it. It's on the curriculum, and we're seeing more and more students coming to study migration. But as David said, that's Holocaust survivors. It's the migration of that community. It is not the migration. Obviously, we teach about other ones, but students are coming in thinking that that's what they're going to learn about. In terms of race, I do agree with what Adina said. It's not necessarily an open preoccupation. And David, I don't agree. I don't remember hearing it as part of the election at all. That does concern me in some senses, because when students come to our museum, they have a lot of misconceptions because we're not talking about it. I had a student last week who came in and we asked, what is a Jew? And they said they have a different blood type. And that is a very common belief that comes to us. And so because we're not having those discussions, a lot of misconceptions are quite rampant. And so there's a different element there, I think, that's worth considering as well.
Go ahead, Mort.
Yeah, so in recent years, I can say with some confidence that the best undergraduate students I've had at McGill, and a lot of the young faculty that I meet at McGill, not just in sociology, but in all sorts of liberal arts disciplines, believe quite strongly that Canada has always been racist, that it is currently racist today, and it probably will remain a white racist society. And when you try to argue against that, you will probably fail. When you try to point out that, now, so this is a subject for a seminar, but this is a perception, I think, and that even if you say, well, look at A, B, and C, that, well, the racism now is more subtle, it's more effective, it's more pernicious, it's microaggression, it goes on and on. And this is the view. So I raised the question then, where do Jews fit in to this sense among many progressive, intelligent students that Canada, like the US, like the UK, and I don't know about Australia, has this fundamental past that is racist, and it continues. And anything that is changed is cosmetic, and it doesn't matter who the governor general is or if Barack Obama was elected. None of that matters. Racism is baked in. And this, I think, is very, common. And it's so where do the Jews fit into this? Do the Jews feel, for example, that Canada or Australia are fundamentally racist? Or are they still, for example, anti-Semitic? I have met, if you look at the polls, you'll say, a lot of, there are Canadians who say Canada remains anti-Semitic, or it is not as bad as the past, but it still has some elements. So where do we Jews fit in to this new sort of rainbow of groups and positions about how bad Canadian society has been for other minorities in the past and the present, and how bad is it for Jews? And well, you've all heard the phrase, can it happen here? If Israel were in trouble, would Canada and would all these countries come to bat for Israel or not? So you have this discussion, and I don't know the answer exactly to where and how Jews should situate themselves within this new discourse. But I think there is a new discourse. Now, I may be wrong, maybe not in Australia. I don't know what you think, David, from your vantage point at York, David Koffman, but I think this is the discourse that I encounter a lot these days.
So I want to just flag that it's something that like we could discuss more, but I want to just take the opportunity to ask one last question before we open to the floor of if there are questions that panelists want to ask other panelists about Australia, Canada comparisons or interactions, and then we're gonna open the floor to questions. Any other questions that we didn't sort of cover, or I didn't prep you for, that while we're actually engaged in a live conversation with one another, you think would be good to mention now when we have a few minutes?
Well, one thing I wanted to mention, this is back to the Holocaust, is as we're approaching this era of no longer having Holocaust survivors with us, I'm curious to see how both the communities in Canada and in Australia, whether they continue along that same track as, parallel in terms of their commitment to Holocaust education and remembrance, or what shifts happen after we have a generation that, is growing up with no survivors. So that's interesting to think about into the future, I think.
Well, I studied families of Holocaust survivors, the survivors and their children. But then I co-authored an academic paper called Grandchildren of Holocaust Survivors. So as someone mentioned, this is an ongoing sort of phenomenon. We can't discuss now the positive and maybe negative impact of this kind of preoccupation with the Holocaust. It's a new preoccupation, I can tell you that. I went to Jewish day schools in the 50s and 60s, and this was not the preoccupation in Jewish day schools at that time, I can tell you. But you raised, Dara, this question about where the future. I mean, again, the Holocaust is a defining element in the identity of Canadian Jews. We know that. I guess the question facing Jewish scholars and Jewish communal leaders like yourselves is, to what extent should we try to tweak that impression of the Holocaust? And you yourself said, and I think you're right, we need to understand the long-term impacts of Holocaust education, different kinds of Holocaust education, emphasizing the specific Jewish angle, emphasizing the universal angles, so that we can see ourselves linked with other minority groups, especially the indigenous groups. All of that's very important. And I think that is a fruitful area of comparative research.
So there's an interesting chat that's going on in the chat function about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. I would like to ask if there are participants in the conference who have questions for our panels about Canada and Australia. If it's specifically something about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, that's fine. But I don't want to digress too much into that interesting parallel conversation that's happening. But I do open it to the floor. You can raise your hand, your virtual hand, and I call on you. Yeah, go ahead, David. To unmute yourself.
Thanks, everybody, for a fascinating comparison of two very distant but also very close countries. There are two gaps that I'd like to hear more about. The relationship between Australian and New Zealand communities, and whether the relationship between Australia and New Zealand communities is rather like the relationship between the US community and the Canadian community. And I chose the order carefully, but also you seem to reduce the Jewish communities to 4 cities: Melbourne, Sydney, Toronto, and Montreal. I certainly know in Canada that there are quite significant and quite often vibrant Jewish communities from coast to coast, including there's a synagogue in St. John's, Newfoundland, to the Far East. And not only is a fairly sizable active community in Vancouver, but also there are multiple shuls, not very multiple, in Victoria. And Victoria is very old. In 2011, I think that's the year, when we were in person at the University of Victoria, we even had a session in the sanctuary of the main conservative synagogue there, which happened to tie in with their 150th anniversary. And this time, local First Nations leaders were invited to the celebration, not when they laid the cornerstone 150 years earlier. So
someone want to respond to small communities question?
Sorry, I'm particularly interested in finding out the relationship between the Australian and New Zealand Jewish communities, and also the life of the smaller communities in both countries, and for my interest, particularly smaller communities in Australia.
Go ahead, David. Yeah, look, from my point of view, the relationship between the communities between New Zealand and Australia probably is simply reflective of the relationship between Australia and New Zealand. They're very close. They're very closely aligned politically, economically, socially. There's plenty of people, certainly with relations in New Zealand and vice versa. But in terms of the community, the Jewish community themselves, there is next to no contact, organizational contact that I'm aware of. Research-wise, has been probably less or comparable levels between Australia and Canada as they've been with Australia and New Zealand. The work does get done in New Zealand, but it's done independently. So the relationship is reflective of the wider society's relations. There's a lot of travel between the two. There was pre-COVID, and there's a lot of how should you say, intermarriage. But yes, in terms of the communities themselves, they operate in their own universes. And just to the other point you mentioned there, David, about we've only really dwelt on Sydney and Melbourne. It is true, and we don't have anyone from Perth on this call, and they would be extremely insulted because they haven't been once. But there is a community in Perth, one of the most isolated cities in the world. It's a sort of big proper Western city. It's a 5-hour flight from here in Sydney, and it's probably closer to Indonesia than anywhere else. But that's still just about 6 or 7% of the population live in Perth. There's a smattering in Brisbane, a smattering in Adelaide, but essentially, in terms of the community, once you've touched on Sydney and Melbourne, you've covered the vast majority. It's not quite the same in Canada, which is interesting, although Toronto's is the big one. There's here, it's only Melbourne doesn't even make 50%. So it is reasonably evenly split. It's not quite the same in Canada.
Just an interesting point jumping off what David said there, which is in terms of the smashing, that doesn't match in terms of Holocaust museums. Obviously, we have a large Holocaust museum in Melbourne and Sydney, but where there's one being built in Perth, in Adelaide, in Queensland, in Darwin, in Canberra. So in terms of just the focus on that doesn't necessarily match where the communities are, which I think is also very interesting.
We think we have like a Holocaust-led small community Jewish identity in Canada. Sort of Holocaust first. I would say it's probably comparable. I mean, I think there's probably, as far as outward facing stuff goes, like synagogues, maybe some of the smaller communities also have small federations, but I think they are mostly religious based, sort of internal questions, and then with their outward exposure is Holocaust or anti-Semitism concerns. Maybe not surprisingly. Are there more questions? Yes, Cassie.
Yeah. So I just wanted to speak to Breann's comments in terms of the multilingualism in Canada. I agree with you, but I can also say that, like, I was born in Ottawa. Then in 1990, I migrated to Toronto, and like, I can see there's a huge difference between the community in Ottawa and the Toronto community, where in Ottawa, I was learning French at the age of like 3. Here, you're not taught French until like you're in grade 4. So I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but I forget her name. But when the presenter was speaking before in French, like I couldn't follow properly because my French has basically disappeared. So I just wanted to know, like, if anyone else wanted to speak to like the why I've always wondered why Torontonians tend not to care about the bilingualism aspect.
Anyone want to have a stab at that?
Sorry. Well, I'm not sure I can answer, but for Toronto, but what I see in Montreal is that languages are we far from a bilingual country. This is just what I wanted to mention. And people are really stuck in their own languages. There is a question here about, I think, Adassa, Danny, did you see it?
Yeah, you know, if you have a question for the panel, like, you can raise your hand and ask it so that we can all hear. There is a chat that's going on. Sometimes it's connected to what other people are saying in the chat. So if you have if you've written a question in the chat and you want the panelists to respond to it or to answer, then just raise your virtual or physical hand and feel free to ask it. Otherwise, the chat's going to just stay as a kind of parallel thing.
Okay.
Jason.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious to hear a little bit more about reconciliation that's going on in the Australian context. Like, what are you drawing on? How are you developing these frameworks? How are you implementing it? You mentioned it a couple of times. I want to hear a little bit more about that context because I'm so unfamiliar with it.
I guess I'll jump in there. So the first thing I should say is that Australia doesn't always get it right, and we have an awful long way to go. And I think that our new government is going to make a significant amount of changes in terms of reconciliation, in particular with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which does talk about an Indigenous voice to Parliament, which we currently do not have. In terms of a reconciliation action plan, that is something that's actually monitored by Reconciliation Australia. So it's actually something where you actually create your plan as to how you're going to have reconciliation in your institution, and actually goes off to Reconciliation Australia, where it is actually checked and it is monitored by the Indigenous community, who then essentially give it a yay or a nay, and it comes back and then you implement. So it is something that is and should always be actually led by the Indigenous community. And it's a process that the Sydney Jewish Museum is just about to begin. So it is something that it's definitely a work in progress. There are some certain standards that we fundamentally have in terms of acknowledgement or welcome to country, so acknowledging the land, that it has been stolen, that it is an unceded territory. So that is something that happens, as I said at the beginning, of all formal events. Most museums I know we're in the process of renovation also have an acknowledgement actually on the way in to the building. You can actually see it written. I'm not sure if David wants to talk about it in terms of JCA, but in terms of our museum, it is something, as I said, where we're in the process of this reconciliation action plan, which is in collaboration with the Indigenous community. You're on mute.
Got me a little late. I actually I do have some comments on it, and I think Breann's position is somewhat more privileged because of your embeddedness in the museum as a sort of a lay member of the Jewish community. I think there's tremendous ignorance in the Jewish community that frankly maps the ignorance in the population at large about Indigenous relations, Indigenous history, and it does look like things are likely to change with the new government. But ultimately, there's an enormous amount of education required here. And in terms of JCA, actually, I think, so JCA, just to remind everyone that wouldn't know, we represent 25 of the big charities here, but none of the synagogues. And that's in Sydney. There is, from my point of view, a complete, not a complete, but an almost complete absence of any meaningful integration and education when it comes to Indigenous relations. The schools, the Jewish schools, have it on the curriculum, but in terms of community, it's not there. It's barely mentioned in synagogues. I don't think the Orthodox rabbinate is particularly interested in it. I've not seen much evidence of that. And I think it's reflective of wider society, that there's a long way to go here. And perhaps we're at the beginning of something a little more concrete and meaningful beyond the welcome to country ceremonies that we do have for 30 seconds, and perhaps there is something to be learnt in Canada, or perhaps the situation in Canada is similar.
I think David's definitely hit on something really important there. I just want to make one, very quick point, which is that we just talked about how many Holocaust museums are going up in Australia. We do not have an Indigenous museum. And so I think that David's definitely hit on the ignorance element perfectly. Sorry.
No, Michelle, this is actually a fascinating conversation that I think we could explore in great detail. And I think there's some interesting research possibilities here as well. I am, however, going to call this panel to a close. We're at 29 minutes past whatever hour you're in, and we have another session here at the ACJS coming at 30 past the hour. So I want to thank the panelists and give everyone a chance to have a very short bio break before we reconvene. So thank you very much. And if you're interested in this conversation, make sure to come out tomorrow to our follow-up one with 3 historians of Canadian Jewish life and 3 Australian Jewish historians of
Thank you,
Australia.
Thank you,
Thank you.
David.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you,
Night,
everyone.
everybody.